Welcome to the Canadian Advisor Cast, podcast dedicated to financial advisors and the people who work with them. My name is Kevin Press. I'm editorial director of Advisor.ca. My special guest today is Dan Richards, an old friend of both Advisor.ca and Investment Executive. He's a professor on the Faculty of Marketing at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. He's Associate Director of the FinHub Student Fellows Program, which he helped launch in 2021 for students with an interest in the fintech space. Dan founded Marketing Solutions, an advisor consultancy from 1989 to 2002, and he published Getting Clients, Keeping Clients in 1998. Proud to say I was at that launch party. Welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Kevin, delighted to be here and delighted to see you again.
It is terrific to see you. Can you believe it's been 34 years since you joined Rotman's marketing faculty?
Well, yes. Kevin, I did begin teaching here, very long time ago. But, for most of the time I've taught at Rotman, I've taught part-time. This was while I was, writing my book and, building my business. I've really been at Rotman full-time since 2016, so coming up 10 years now.
What are you teaching these days?
So I'm teaching a variety of courses. I teach actually in 5 programs, the Executive MBA, Executive Programs, Full-Time MBA, Commerce. I also teach 400 arts and science students on fundamentals of marketing. But the course that I'd say I get the most feedback on is a course called One-to-One Marketing, which is all about communicating effectively in all its forms, which I teach both in the MBA and the Commerce program.
That's really what marketing is about at the end of the day, isn't it? It's about delivering that message and a dialogue truly with the audience you're targeting.
Sure. And I think that one of the things that I spent a lot of time going back to when I was doing a lot of work with advisors and today with students is talking about the most important part of any conversation is, in fact, the conversation, the dialogue, the back and forth. I point to research with students on the optimum amount of time in any conversation that you're trying to make a sale, whether it be a financial advisor making a sale or building deeper relationships or a student applying for a job. The optimum amount of time talking versus listening is about 1/3 talking and about 2/3 roughly listening, called the 60-40 rule. And by the way, that applies across many, many forms.
How have the students changed during your time as a prof?
Immeasurably. So when I began teaching in the early 90s, Rotman, frankly, was not that diverse. And I think business schools weren't that diverse. It was mainly white males. Today, many were women. We're close to 50-50, much more ethnic diversity from around the world. In the MBA program, about 65% of our students are international. So that's the composition. But the other big change, when I began teaching, remember, 1992, that was before the internet as we know it today. And so the transformation in the whole dynamic in every form, in teaching, but also in business, is so fundamentally different compared to what it was.
Yeah, and of course, following the introduction, the commercialization of the internet, you had the introduction of social media. I mean, the marketing profession is really barely recognizable now compared to those early days.
Absolutely. I think barely recognizable is a good description. And, social media has played a role for sure. But I think there is a bigger shift that's happened directly as a result of the internet. And what we've seen in almost every category is a shift in power to the consumer. And that's a function of the information that students have, that consumers have, that clients have, that didn't have before. And that shift in power, it's not going back. We know that that is going to be a permanent shift. And so the challenge is in every field, no matter what line of business you're in, is how do you accommodate the way you operate to that new reality?
You talk for us about how that shows up in financial services marketing specifically.
Well, Kevin, it shows up in many, many, many ways. So, for example, one of the things that I talk about in the courses that I teach is an article that was published in Business Review in 1960. So 65 years ago by a professor at HBR, Harvard Business School, named Ted Levitt. The article was called Marketing Myopia. That article is still the number one most republished article in the marketing field every year by Harvard Business Review. Remarkable. And Ted Levitt talked about examples of industries like the train industry, the railroad industry, which was one of the most profitable industries at the turn of the 20th century in 1900. And what happened? How did it go off the rails, so to speak? And of course, the automobile came along. And what Levitt went back and looked at and said, what was the response from the railroad CEOs and the folks running the railroads to the car? And they scoffed. They laughed. They said, like, who on earth would want to give up a comfortable, reliable form of transportation to deal with something that is, unreliable, smelly, kind of uncertain, expensive, and got it completely wrong. And what Ted Levitt said, the problem with the railroad industry was that they saw themselves, they defined their business as being in the railroad industry, not the transformation industry. And that's a parallel when you take a look at businesses that go wrong, that you see time and time again, where they fundamentally misread the core benefit that they're providing to customers. And you could look at BlackBerry and how dismissive they were when the iPhone was launched in 2008, not that long ago. So let's come back to the financial industry. And, something I think that the financial industry gets very wrong is they misdefine the business that they're in. A lot of financial advisors say, well, I'm in the business of providing advice or, getting returns or building portfolios or managing risk or optimizing taxes. And that's the core business that I'm in. That's the value that I provide. I'm going to suggest to you, Kevin, there may be a few clients for whom that's the key thing they look for, but only a few. The large majority of Canadians and investors say what I'm really looking for is a sense that I have a plan that's going to get me to where I want to go, that I'm going to be in control of my financial future. And when I talk to financial advisors today, I still spend, a lot of time talking to financial advisors that I've dealt with for many, many years. Very few focus on that outcome. Most still talk about building portfolios and managing risk. And I think that is a big blind spot for the industry. And I think it creates a very big vulnerability. If there's a new alternative that comes along, someone like, let's say, Wealthsimple, that begins to position themselves a little differently towards that core benefit.
It's so true. You're talking about focusing on process as opposed to outcomes. But the other interesting piece of what you're describing is that peace of mind that I think advisors, if they're really thoughtful about the service that they provide, it's giving the client that sense of security about their long-term well-being, their future.
There's no question. And, one of the things, and look, I am a big fan of the financial advisor industry. I think that on balance, it creates huge value for clients. But that said, one of the things we know, what correlates with long-term financial success for clients? And Morningstar has done a study on this. This was some years ago, but I think it still applies today. The number one factor that correlated with long-term financial success was having a written financial plan. And the fact is that when I talk to financial advisors, in many cases, some advisors, as a matter of course, say to clients, new clients or existing clients, look, we need to do a plan. That plan will kind of create the roadmap. But many advisors that I've talked to say, well, it's really time consuming and clients don't want to spend the time and I don't really see the value and I'll be fine, without it. But I think that creates a very big point of vulnerability because, coming back to Wealthsimple, if Wealthsimple or someone like Wealthsimple, a new disruptor, said, using artificial intelligence, we are now able to create a customized, personalized financial plan that will track your progress against your peer group, against people like you, and create a map that you'll be able to follow and know whether you're on track. I think for many, many Canadians, that would be something that would be quite compelling, particularly younger Canadians who are very uncertain today and are looking for that kind of guidance.
We're a few years on from the initial introduction of that kind of digital financial advice experience. How is Wealthsimple doing in your estimation? And then more broadly, how is that segment of the industry progressing?
So, Wealthsimple, if you had asked this question 3 or 4 years ago, there would have been a lot of uncertainty as to whether they were really going to be able to get meaningful traction. Yeah, they're kind of a niche player, but are they a mainstream player? And one of the things one of the courses that I teach relates to fintech marketing and strategy. And we actually have founders of companies like Wealthsimple and Zensurance and Borrowell and Neo and Coho out to talk to the class. And one of the things that I talk about in that course is the hockey stick. So around the world, founders of companies talk about the hockey stick, even though those that have never played hockey, have never watched hockey, have no idea what hockey is. Because what you see with almost every successful startup is the growth is never a straight line up. There tends to be a long period where you're seeing a little bit of progress, and that's when you're along the blade, and then all of a sudden you get an upward turn, and that's when you move up the shaft. And that's true of Netflix, that's true of Facebook, that's true of Time and Trust. It was also true of Wealthsimple. So from 2014 to about 2020, they got some movement, but it wasn't dramatic. They've seen dramatic improvement and growth since then. They've got real momentum. The last reported number, they're at $100 billion in assets. The forecast is they're going to gather more new assets this year or last year in 2025 than any of the major banks except RBC. So Wealthsimple has kind of got that escape velocity. They've got that trajectory. They've got that momentum, but they've got something else that's critically important. And that is when I talk to my students, I talk to my former students. When I'm in touch with a lot of my former students who are now in their late 20s, 30s, early 40s, they're now doing well. They've got buying houses. They're getting meaningful bonuses. They're now significant, starting to get significant wealth. And when I talk to them, most of them are dealing with Wealthsimple and view Wealthsimple as kind of the best solution for them and someone like them. And the real threat to the financial industry and to financial advisors goes back a little bit, Kevin, but to the early days in the early 90s when the financial, advice industry was starting to take off. And at that time, if you held GICs, you were kind of embarrassed to talk about it because that was viewed as a sign of someone not that sophisticated. Well, I think there's a real risk that 2, 3, 4 years from now, unless things change, that if you're in your 30s, early 40s, you're a professional, you're doing well, that you'll be embarrassed to say that I'm working with one of the large banks. That will be a sign of a lack of sophistication. I'm positing that as a hypothesis. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it could happen when you look at the current trajectory.
Well, and certainly if you look at what's emerged as a standard practice across multiple channels, most appear happy to have young clients begin in a robo-advice environment, even if that means they're working with the competition. They're not interested until the client reaches a minimum asset level. That seems a dangerous bet for the industry to make.
So absolutely. So let me give you a firsthand example. I had a conversation last fall with two former students who met at Rotman, and they ended up becoming partners, and they've been out now, I guess, maybe 6 or 8 years. One of them both doing very well in their careers. One of them works for a consulting firm. Another is at a senior level with a healthcare institution, and they started developing meaningful assets, meaningful wealth, and they said, "Geez, not sure whether we're on the right track." And so they said, "Okay, so we maybe should look at figuring what to do." And they'd read that they should have a financial plan. So one of them talked to someone who happens to be with one of the banks, who introduced them to someone at the brokerage firm. But they paid off their tuition and they bought a house, so they didn't have a lot of liquid cash at this point. They maybe had a couple $100,000. It wasn't enough. Wasn't enough to kind of get the serious attention of that financial advisor, to the point they might have been willing to accept them as a client, but wouldn't be able to do a plan. And that's a bit of an indictment, I think, of the mindset. And that's so short-term thinking. So guess what? They're at Wealthsimple, and they're quite happy at Wealthsimple. And I think there is a real risk to the financial industry that we're going to wake up and discover that we've lost a generation of younger, ambitious, successful Canadians.
From a pure market development perspective, this strikes me as counterproductive. We risk losing a generation of new clients. I understand why firm executives need to focus on profitability, but this can't be good for the industry, can it?
So that's a great question, Kevin. And I think, when you take a look at the once dominant companies that have run into hard times or maybe vanished entirely, we can think about names like Kodak, Sears. People, forget the fact that in 1970, Sears had the level of sales in the US that its top three competitors did combined. Their sales in 1970 were about $15 billion. Walmart was 30 million. And, you can run down the list of once leading, dominant, successful players that have either become irrelevant or have vanished entirely. And the challenge is that it is hard to embrace fundamental change when you're successful. Incredibly hard. Because, incremental change, yes, sure, of course. But fundamental change, that's much harder. And so I participated in a session with Deloitte where they brought all of their consultants from Canada and the US together, and it was all online. And spent some time talking about what's happening in the challenger banking space. And we had someone from the UK where the challenger banks, in fact, that's the most developed market in the world for challenger banks. Revolut is based there, and Monzo and some others. And we talked about Canada, we talked about the US, and I got asked the question, so if I'm running a bank, like what would I do to deal with the threat of challenger banks, whether it be Questrade or whether it be Coho or Neo or Wealthsimple? And my response was, I don't think you can do it with a business as usual kind of mindset. So if I was running one of the big banks and said, look, this is something that we need to give serious attention to, I would say, I want to put a team together, 10, 12, 15, whatever number of my brightest, most tech savvy, most with it, high potential managers in their, late 20s, 30s, maybe early 40s. And I would say, okay, I'm gonna give you 3 months, or maybe 3 months is enough, maybe it needs to be 6 months, but create kind of an entirely different entity outside of the established organization. In the tech world, that's called creating a skunkworks kind of mindset. So you're basically not constrained by the normal bounds and parameters in terms of doing the exploratory thinking. And then come back with a plan that says, here are the trade-offs, here's what we could do. Maybe you don't embrace all of it, but at least you're able to get outside of the conventional thinking.
I think a lot of individual financial advisors are aware of these industry trends and concerns. And I'm curious if you have recommendations for someone who works in the industry. In light of all of this, what can they do differently? What should they be thinking about as they market their own individual practice?
Well, Kevin, that is a great question because, if you're working for a large firm, you're constrained clearly by what you can do. So, for example, onboarding and compliance is a friggin' nightmare. Every financial advisor I know complains about that. I was talking to a financial advisor who just got approval to hire, and he's paying 100% of the cost, someone full time just to do onboarding and paperwork. But that's the reality for the advisor's life. You're other than doing what this advisor is doing, there's not much you can do. And even though you can say it's insane, and if you take a look, I don't want to keep coming back to Wealthsimple, but they are the obvious example of someone who's figured it out. How is it possible? The onboarding process for someone like Wealthsimple or Coho can be so much easier than for the incumbents. But let's come back to your question, which is, as a financial advisor, what can you do? I'm going to suggest to you a couple of things to think about. One of them is to really take a hard look at the mindset that you have with your existing clients. Many advisors believe that what makes clients, what leads to satisfaction, is, again, returns, results. So, two things on that. First of all, many advisors believe that having satisfied clients is that's their goal. Well, frankly, satisfaction is a very, very, very low bar. The data is that if all that a client says, there was a study in the U.S. by Pershing, where they asked clients, how satisfied are you? Of those that said that they are satisfied as opposed to totally satisfied, 50% said they would be open to leaving. So the first thing as an advisor you have to do is to dramatically elevate your aspiration in terms of how satisfied you aspire your clients to be. I used to do a talk talking about how do you create client ecstasy. And why ecstasy? Because, let's suppose you go to a restaurant, someone says to you the next day, how was it? You say, it was fine, I was satisfied. That's not much of a recommendation. So the first thing you need to do is raise your sights. Secondly, what creates satisfaction? Again, the research is clear. The number one thing that creates satisfaction among clients generally is, yes, you need to have threshold acceptable performance, clearly, but it's having a sense that my advisor listens, my advisor cares, and my advisor knows my situation, and they put my interest first. And so doing that and then communicating that you're doing that. So, for example, one of the things that I talked about 20 years ago, but I think it still pertains today, is every meeting should have a client agenda, should have an agenda. And the first item maybe should be blank. And you say, here's the agenda we agreed to. But what else is there? What's happened that's important in your life that's not on this agenda? And I've had cases where clients said, something came up, might be related to a health issue with a spouse or one of their kids was struggling, whatever, and the whole meeting got derailed. Doesn't matter. You're still dealing with the most important issue. So developing a mindset where the standard of satisfaction that you aspire to is much higher than it's been historically. And then secondly, really focusing on building that trust. And how do you build that trust? You build that trust by asking good questions, by listening, by having clients feel that they're heard.
One of the key customer experience best practices is proactive contact. Does that apply to the financial advice business?
The key is it's not just being proactive, which is the quantity of communication, but it's the quality of communication. It's the, again, the depth of communication and that dialogue. One of the things, coming back to your question, what can an advisor do? So I have a series of articles that appear once a year. I do a series of articles in Globe and Mail, and I had an article appear just a couple of weeks ago talking about the artificial intelligence and how transformative it's already been and how transformative it's inevitably going to continue to be, and how people should respond. And I talked about you need to learn, you need to adapt, you need to get into the habit of building and just making it part of your normal routine. And I was talking to a very successful financial advisor. And the advisor said, well, yeah, I get that AI can help me draft emails, but it's pretty trivial in terms of what its applications are beyond that. Would you agree with that, Kevin? That for most advisors that there's limited utility today to artificial intelligence?
Absolutely, no question. A lot of fear there, but I think the opportunity is much greater than the industry seems to think so far.
Well, so what's interesting? So I said to this advisor, now recognizing you've got some constraints in terms of the technology your firm lets you use. So let's accept that. But let's suppose that you have a meeting coming up with a client and you're able to use an AI platform to help you draft the agenda for that meeting based on the previous conversations you've had. And so you look at the agenda. Maybe you're going to change it. We don't accept. I teach a course in communication. We use artificial intelligence. I talk to my students about co-working, collaborating with artificial intelligence. So draft an email, but make it yours first. Then say to AI, how do I make this better? Compare the two, cut and paste. So you end up with something that is better than what you do on your own, but is still yours. So coming back to what that advisor can do. So you got the agenda, you send it to the client. When you meet, you say to the client, would you mind if we recorded this conversation so that I can review it afterwards for notes? Most clients can say sure. So at the end of that, you get the platform you're using to create a summary, maybe two versions of the summary, a detailed summary that goes into the client file and a shorter form summary that goes to the client. And again, you're going to amend that, you're going to tweak it, but that then sets up the next meeting. But beyond that, what today, this is not pie in the sky technology. This is a platform that exists today for financial advisors. You can get a client sentiment score. So you actually can get a reading on how satisfied is this client. To what extent are they a flight risk based on the questions they ask, the tone of voice, how long their responses were. And then on top of that, you're able to get some suggestions saying, next time, here are things you should talk about to that client. This is not some kind of futuristic technology. This technology exists today. Now, most firms, in fact, I'm not aware of any firm in Canada, this is a US-based technology called Jump AI that's implemented this, but it's coming. Meanwhile, if I'm an advisor, I want to get familiar and comfortable with artificial intelligence. I want to spend some time so that I'm conversant with what it's capable of today.
And so that you can advocate at the firm level for what tools are available and should be adopted.
So you can advocate at the firm level for sure, but there are things that you can do in terms of utilizing. Many firms are using Copilot, for example. So you're able to use platforms like Copilot to improve your workflow, to help you improve and optimize the emails you send, your agendas, all of those things.
What concerns you on the AI front, Dan? It obviously has some implications for scamming and fraudsters. What's on your radar?
So, when you look at artificial intelligence, it's a combination. My response is twofold. It's incredibly exciting when you see the potential of what's there. It's also terrifying, and it's terrifying for in terms of in a number of fronts. In terms of there's been lots of narrative about what the impact on jobs is going to be. The potential for fraud is real. The ability that AI has to in one sentence. For example, Kevin, somebody could take this podcast, capture your voice, capture mine, and simulate our voices, and then reach out to friends or family, creating, that we've all perhaps read about those false claims. Oh my God, I'm in an accident. I need $2,000 right away or whatever. That's scary. That's terrifying, but it's real. And, we have to accept that. Then there are some trivial things as well. I think that AI, I've used AI in my classes for 3 years. And I've used it, particularly to, when I have writing assignments, I will assign students writing assignments, but show here's what artificial intelligence would do. Frankly, 3 years ago, it was pretty bad. The response to a prompt was too long, too formal, too flowery. It clearly didn't look like it was written by you or me. It's gotten dramatically better. So the pace of improvement is the other thing that's remarkable. Again, both exciting and scary, but it's real. It's here today. And, if as a financial advisor, you're saying, oh, I'm only in the business for another year or two, I don't have to worry. Okay, fine, maybe. But if you've got a longer term plan, you better get, with the reality. By the way, we've been here before. In the article that I wrote in the Globe, talking about how the resolution for 2026 for many people should be, today the data is only 10% of knowledge workers are using AI every day. Become one of that 10%. It's not going to be 10% for very long, but it's 10% today. Become one of the 10% by building it into your workflow, opening a browser on your computer, setting a goal for I'm going to use AI 6, 8, 10, whatever number of times a day. But I talked in that article we entered before. In 1980, we saw the introduction of personal computers. And many people saw personal computers as gimmicks, as toys, as gadgets, did not take them seriously. They were dismissed. But those that saw the opportunity, saw the potential, that embraced PCs, ended up seeing their careers, spike upwards as a result. So I think there's going to be a similar division today, except it's going to happen faster.
I want to spend some time talking about your career, Dan, because it really has been extraordinary. You emerged as an early thought leader in the practice management field. Did you have a sense in those early days of how much demand there would be for your services?
Kevin, absolutely not. This was 1989, and I tell my students that sometimes in life, it's much, much, much better to be lucky than to be smart. And I was just incredibly lucky, as was anybody else who ended up deciding to focus on, financial advice as their career. Nobody could have seen this coming.
And then 9 years later, getting clients, keeping clients, 100,000 copies sold all over the world. And basically, it's about a lot of what we've been talking about, right? It's fundamentally about communicating with clients.
So, one of the things that at the core, again, I think about the way I teach, and I teach a concept, a very simple concept called inside out thinking versus outside in thinking. So inside out thinking starts from your point of view as a company or as an advisor, and how do we optimize things given how we're working. And the classic example of that, going back to the 1920s, was Henry Ford, who kind of pioneered the automobile, who said, you can have a Model T in any color, provided it's black. And, because of that made sense operationally when you're making cars. It's much more efficient to only have one color. And then Alfred Sloan came along at General Motors and said, a car for every purse and every purpose. And operated rather than from an inside out point of view, from an outside in point of view, starting with the customer's point of view. That does not mean we give customers everything they want, because if we did that, we'd give everything away for free, wouldn't have a business. But that core concept of starting from the customer's point of view. And that is one of the things that I talked about from the very beginning when I was doing work with financial advisors. And that was the core concept underlying getting clients, keeping clients, whether it be the keeping clients part or the getting clients part, equally important. But in both cases, starting where you're 100% rooted in understanding where clients are. And I think that was true then. And guess what? I think it's true today.
I was fortunate to have met you early in my career. That idea that you've just articulated had a big effect on me. It reminded me to think about the reader's perspective as a journalist, and later about the customer when I worked in the insurance industry. You've been a foundational contributor to the professionalization of the financial advice business. Are you proud of the influence that you've had?
Yes, Kevin, I am proud. I feel very gratified. The most gratifying moment of my day comes when a student reaches out to me, either a current student or a former student, saying, that I've made a meaningful difference in their careers. And equally, I've had a lot of advisors who've said that as a result, either whether it be of getting clients, keeping clients, my book, the talks that I delivered, my columns in Investment Executive, that I made a meaningful difference in helping their success. That's incredibly gratifying. It can't not be gratifying. And so I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have come into this industry. Now, I started in consumer packaged goods. And so I think that's something that was incredibly helpful. So my early training after business school was working in consumer packaged goods for companies like General Foods and Pepsi-Cola. I was VP marketing for Wrigley. And before I moved into the financial industry, that gave me a grounding that was invaluable and that stayed with me to this day.
I wanted to ask you about business school because I learned this about you preparing for this episode. You went straight to Harvard Business School after getting your undergrad at the age of 19. Why? What was the hurry?
Well, so Kevin, sometimes I've run into people who said, I have my career, I had a great plan, and I kind of gone through my life. I was the opposite of that. I did not have a plan. So what happened was when I was in my third year at McGill, I got on a bus, and I happened to be sit down beside someone, and I had known him. He was like 3 years ahead of me at McGill in the debating club. I was on the debating club, and he was in the debating club, but he was in fourth year. I was in first year, so I knew him a little bit. And so I said, his name was Denis Gagnon. And so I said, so Denis, tell me, what are you up to? How are things going? He says, well, I've been working for one of the banks, but actually next fall I'm going to Harvard Business School to do my MBA. And I said, okay, so two questions. First of all, what's an MBA? And secondly, I've heard of Harvard, obviously. What's Harvard Business School? And like my undergraduate degree was not in business. I did economics. So we talked about it a little bit. And so I was planning to go to law school. But I said, well, maybe I'll just for fun, I'll apply to Harvard Business School. It was the only business school I applied to. And I had to take my the standardized test, but I did that and I did fairly well. Anyway, I got in. And so I didn't know any better. I think Harvard, frankly, would have done me a huge favor if they'd said, look, okay, fine, we're prepared to accept you, but go and work for 2 or 3 years first. They would have done me a huge favor, but they didn't. And so I said, okay, so I've got law school, I've got business school, but business school is 2 years, law school is 3 years. That two sounds better than three. That was the sum total of my logical thought process. I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't do a more fundamental deep dive into that decision than that.
Do you worry about the number of young people who choose to become financial advisors these days? We're seeing the industry age pretty rapidly.
So I think it is an issue for sure. Absolutely. I think that we've talked about potentially losing a generation of younger clients. I think there's a risk of losing a generation of financial advisors as well coming up. I think absolutely for sure.
Is there something the industry can do?
Well, I think I'm going to suggest to you there are two things, maybe more than two, but at least two things the industry can do. First of all, you know, we need to recognize that the job market has changed, and it's easier, frankly, to recruit people than in the past, and there just aren't that many proactive opportunities for starting roles as financial advisors that are just on the radar screen. Scotia actually a few years ago ran a program where they brought in a cohort of, I think, primarily commerce grads, but also some MBAs with a view to kind of getting them trained first and then into branches. And I think maybe as a result of cost cutting that ended. But that kind of an initiative, I think makes a ton of sense where you're bringing, not just young talent. Look, today it's easier to hire people because it's a tough job market, but that's not what you want. You don't want talent. You want the best talent. You want the very best talent. Banks are there. Banks are competing for the best talent for investment banking, for example, or for their all of the banks have rotation programs that they're hiring incredibly smart, kind of graduates from MBA programs and commerce programs for. That's not happening in the financial advice space. So I think that's the first thing, recognizing that there needs to be an investment similar to what the banks are making and life insurance companies are making in terms of hiring, um, you know, bright talent for rotation programs. It's not that it's not happening; it's happening, but not in the financial advice arms. But the other thing is, I think the message has to change. Historically, the pitch to somebody to become a financial advisor was do this and you'll work hard, but the financial rewards are outstanding. And that's been the really the bulk of the pitch. And my view is, yes, financial rewards are important. And, it's hard work. Building a book has never been easy. It's not easy today. So yes, to justify the pain and the risk of failure, the financial rewards have to be attractive, but that's not enough. What I don't think the financial industry is talking about nearly enough is the opportunity to make a positive impact in people's lives. And there are very few careers, and I talk about this to some of my students, there are very few careers where you can make the positive impact on many people's lives that you can as a financial advisor. And I just think the financial industry isn't talking about that. It's a huge opportunity. And there are lots of people, I think, when I look at my students who would be interested if it was presented that way.
Such a perfect note to end on. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate your time.
Kevin, thank you for the opportunity to talk today. Great talking to you again.
My guest has been Dan Richards, Rotman Professor, longtime contributor to Investment Executive, Advisor.ca, the Globe and Mail, and the Harvard Business Review. Canadian Advisor Cast is a production of Newcom Media. It's produced by Alicia Hyatt. Nushin Ziafati is our associate producer. My name's Kevin Press. Thanks for being with us.